The Golden Amazons of Venus by John Murray Reynolds. From Planet Stories, Winter 1939. As found on Project Gutenberg. Read by Julie Hoverson. Golden Amazons of Venus, Part 9, The End! Before attempting a landing as they came to the golden city of Lar, the flotilla of flying cars swept in a wide circle over the city and its surrounding suburbs. Great fires burned in braziers along the walls. Other fires had been kindled by the besiegers. Dozens of cottages outside the circuit of the city walls were also aflame, blazing furiously. The whole place was suffused with a ruddy and uneven light, and the observers in the flying cars had a clear view of the scene below. Behind the battlements and bastions atop the city's walls crouched the golden Amazons of the garrison, loosing their storms of arrows at the swarming besiegers below them. Other tawny-skinned crews worked the alta-ray tubes that belched blasts of blue flame at regular intervals. Wherever the blue beams struck, the ground was blackened, while the twisted and charred shapes of scaly ones writhed in brief agony. The myriad brazen trumpets of Lar sounded hasty rallying calls, or else tossed staccato signals from one part of the defenses to another. The hordes of Lanza had invested the city on three sides, the marshland on the far border of the city protecting that side from direct assault. Groups of scaly ones took shelter behind tree trunks and mounds of earth, and any other possible cover, firing their gas guns up at the battlements in an effort to lessen the arrow fire. Others crept forward behind movable metal shields. Heavy-caliber gas guns inched slowly forward behind wooden mantlets that bristled with arrows, and hurled their larger explosive bullets up at the walls. Wherever they struck, there was a puff of yellow dust and a scarred place on the stones. Reptilian trumpets beat with a staccato thunder as Lanza kept in touch with his various divisions. Not all the advantage was with the besiegers, however. Even as Jerry watched, a blue heat ray struck full on one of the big gas guns and blew it up with a shattering crash. In all but one particular, the battle was a large-scale edition of the type of assault the scaly ones had tried against various barrier forts in the past. The difference was that they now possessed the Supode ray, which Lanza had been able to prepare for his forces. Long beams of the familiar murky reddish light were continually playing upon the walls of Lar. The effect of the Supode rays seemed to be less serious than Jerry would have expected. Perhaps Lanza's ray guns were lacking in power because inefficiently made. Perhaps the yellow stones that formed the walls of Lar contained some radioactive substance that partially neutralized the rays. The walls were crumbling into powder in dozens of small spots as the searching beams of the rays found a weak point or flaw in the stone, but there was none of the wholesale collapse that Lanza had probably hoped to achieve. The whole scene below was like a macabre nightmare. The fires flashed and crackled, and the explosive bullets of the scaly ones twinkled like fireflies through the drifting smoke. Red light glinted on the points of flying arrows. Savisan trumpets blared defiance to the thunder of reptilian drums. Most dramatic of all, silent but terribly deadly, was the duel of the raycasters as the red beams of the attackers and the blue rays of the defenders darted back and forth through the night like the rapiers of fencing giants. The flotilla of flying cars darted down to the plaza in front of the Tower of the Arrow. The pilots kept them invisible until they had landed, lest the nervous crew of a defending ray machine blast them before their identity was known. As soon as the dimensional control was switched off, there were cries of alarm, and a few hasty arrows glanced harmlessly off the Earthman's armor. Then Klozana shouted reassuringly, and they were recognized. A little later, Jerry and a few of his officers stood with Rupin Sang on one of the balconies of the great tower. The aged king of Savisa wore full armor, though in the shadows of his gilded helmet, his face looked old and gray and tired. Beside them, a squad of the Golden Amazons worked a long-range ray tube that was firing at the rear areas of the reptilian position. The muscles of the feminine warriors rippled beneath their tawny skins as they swung the heavy controls of the big ray machine. "They came against one of our barrier forts from the rear, in great numbers," Rupin Sang said wearily. "I cannot imagine how they had managed to get so many men in behind our lines." Probably brought them underwater in that submarine they used when they took me captive, Jerry said. Brought them through in relays. I should have sent you warning to block the river channel against that craft, but I never thought Lanza would strike so quickly. At least we had enough warning to prepare for the defense of the city after they broke through the frontier, Rupin Sang said. We called in all the surrounding troops. We sent the very young and the very old, the ill and the crippled, back to comparative safety in the hills by way of secret trails through the swamps. If the walls will stand against the new rays the scaly ones are using, we should be able to hold out for a long time. The armor of my men is proof against either rays or explosive bullets, Jerry told him, and our ray guns are superior to those that Lanza has been able to make. We'll use my men as shock troops to beat back any particularly pressing attack. Between us, we can hang on until Lanza gets tired of the siege. I hope you're right, Rupin Sang said gloomily, but I recall the old prophecy. It is in my mind that the end of the golden city of Lar is at hand, and that the sands of my nation run very low. However, we will fight to the end. No bunch of half-lizards led by a white renegade is going to lick me, Jerry rasped. A week later, Jerry Norton was less confident. Haggard and unshaven, he stalked into an inner room and tossed his helmet clattering on the table. His armor was badly dented by the impact of many explosive bullets, and one forearm was burned where a supode ray had momentarily pierced between the chinks of the armor. All right, Steve, Jerry said wearily. It's your watch. Go up on the walls and take over. Anything new? Steve Brent asked, sitting up on the cot where he had been sleeping and running both hands through his tousled crop of sandy hair. His freckled face was as lined and drawn as Jerry's own. Another of the bastions on the west wall came down under the rays, but we're holding the breach all right with archers and a portable raycaster. Hurry and get up there like a good fella. I left Portok in charge, and he's dead on his feet. I'm not so damn much alive myself, Steve muttered, but he put on his helmet and went clanking off up the corridor. Jerry sat down heavily on a bench, at the moment too tired to even take off his armor. The city of Lar still held out, but that was all that could be said. The scaly ones still pressed the assault day and night without ceasing. The once mighty walls of yellow stone were crumbling under the constant attack of the walls, while the defense of the steadily widening breaches put an added strain on the dwindling numbers of the garrison. If only the Viking would come! Her Duralite hull would withstand either rays or explosives, and her own powerful ray tubes should be able to blast the attacking artillery out of existence and thereby raise the siege. But he could not raise the spaceship on the radio. That was the thing that worried Jerry most of all. Tanda had been trying at hourly intervals for days, but he could not get any answer from McTavish. At last, Jerry stretched out on the cot that Steve had quitted, and almost instantly went to sleep. It seemed only a moment later that he awoke to find Portok the Martian shaking him by the shoulder. Jerry laboriously raised himself up on one elbow, shaking his head to clear his brain. So strong were the bonds of sleep that several seconds passed before his brain grasped the meaning of the words that Portok was shouting in his ear. Chief, can't you hear me? The whole western wall has come down, carrying all the ray tubes with it. The scaly ones are in the city. Jerry seized his helmet and weapons from the table where he had thrown them and dashed out of the room. From one of the balconies of the Arrow Tower he could see the swift disaster that had come upon the city of Lar. The ceaseless, unrelenting play of Lanza's supode ray machines had finally weakened the city's western wall until the whole rampart had collapsed. The once towering wall was now only a long mound of rubble. The companies of scaly ones nearest the wall had been buried in the debris when it fell, but fresh hordes were pouring forward with a shrill yelping. The Amazon archers defending the wall from above had been mainly crushed in the wreckage. Reserve regiments were hurrying into place at the double, bowstrings twanging and long golden hair streaming out behind them, but there was one loss that could not be replaced. All the alta-ray machines on that wall were shattered and broken. The despairing courage of Lar's feminine defenders was not enough to hold that mile-long pile of rubbish whose sloping sides could be easily climbed by the swarming hordes from Girivaka. The Amazons were falling back all along the line. The retreat was a slow and stubborn one, but it was steady. Such of the altar-ray machines as could be brought to bear upon the shattered wall from other portions of the fortifications swept the advancing scaly ones with blue blasts that tore gaping holes in their ranks, but there were not enough of them. The firelight gleamed on the armor of a few of the Vikings' men who were fighting with the rearguard, their ray guns stabbing viciously into the reptilian ranks as they fell back. The drums of the scaly ones took on a deep-mouthed bellow of triumph, and the brazen trumpets of Lar were the voice of a forlorn and fading hope. Rupin Sang appeared on the balcony beside Jerry, leaning his gnarled old hands on the rail. He was smiling, as though final disaster had at least brought a relief from strain. "This is the end of the city of Lar," he said. "The ancient prophecy of Jedakana comes true after all. Save yourself and your men while you can, my friend." "Can't we all escape through the swamps and put up a better fight in the hills?" Jerry asked. Rupin Sang shook his head. "No, my friend. The last survivors will do that when all is over, but we will defend Lar to the end. Street by street and house by house, as is the tradition of Savisa. We are the last descendants of the old ones. We may die, but we will do it with honor." The swift advance of Lance's men bit deeply into the city, halfway from the shattered wall to the central plaza surrounding the great tower, before it was checked at a line of hasty barricades. There was bitter house-to-house fighting all across the city. Jerry knew that the stand at the barricades could not be sustained for very long. The advance of the scaly ones had, at the moment, outdistanced their supode ray casters and their heavy-caliber gas guns. For the present, the Amazon arrows held them checked. The advance was sure to resume as soon as Lance's heavy weapons could be brought up again. It was a hopeless fight, and yet Jerry could not bring himself to leave. Partly it was his affection for the grief-stricken but indomitable Clozana that held him there. Partly it was the sheer courage of the Amazon's gallant fight against such heavy odds that kept him in the battle line. By some standards, the affair was none of his business, but he could not quit now. However, he had not the right to hold his men in the stricken city if they wished to leave. As he located the various members of the Vikings' crew in the disorganized Amazon ranks, he gave each one permission to escape from the city through the eastern marshes. Portok's reaction was typical. "Run from these snake-skinned devils?" the little Martian panted hoarsely, his ruddy face gaunt and his eyes sunken deep in their sockets. "Not while I can still stand. I'm staying with the rear guard, as long as there is one." New fires had been started by the victory-drunk reptilians, fires within the walls. The lurid glow of burning houses made the night hideous. Fully a third of the city was in flames by now, and only the easterly wind kept the flames from driving the defenders away from those portions of the city that they still held. By noon the next day, the tale was nearly all told. The Savisans now held less than a third of their city, a V-shaped sector with the arrow tower at its apex. The murky beams of supode rays were now continually playing against the walls of the great tower itself, and small cascades of pulverized rock kept sliding off the face of the stonework as the weaker parts began to decompose under the steady impact of the rays. And still the fight went on. Jerry had forgotten what it was like to lie down and rest. He was leaning in an angle of the wall, actually asleep on his feet, when Chester Sand from the Viking hurried across to him. "Rupin Sang wants to see you down in the garden right away, Chief," Sand panted. "You and Steve Brent both." "All right, get Steve," Jerry growled. He sighed and tightened his belt and went wearily down the steps to the lower floor of the tower. The pleasant walled garden behind the tower was a very different place from the setup Jerry had seen when he first came to Savisa. The explosive bullets of the scaly ones had ripped up many of the trees and shattered the marble statues. A heap of debris fallen from above lay along the base of the tower wall, while more was constantly trickling down as the murky beams of the supode rays crisscrossed overhead. The bodies of dead Amazons were scattered here and there on the trampled grass. Dense clouds of acrid smoke from the burning city swirled down over the garden wall. Clozana was waiting in the garden, her armor dim and battered. Her left arm was heavily bandaged, but she still carried a naked sword in her right hand. "I was told that you wanted me," she said. Jerry shook his head. No, it was your father who sent for me." Just then Steve and Chester Sand came across the garden. A faint suspicion began to stir in Jerry's mind. "Where is Rupin Sang?" he demanded. Sand hesitated and cleared his throat. His eyes were shifty. Then Jerry heard a slight sound behind him. He spun around and looked squarely into the muzzle of a ray tube held by Lanza himself. They had been neatly trapped. Lanza and a dozen of his men had come up through the sewers and slain the Amazon guards posted there. "Drop your weapons," Lanza snapped. Jerry shrugged and obeyed, and the others followed his example. There was a triumphant smile on the renegade's saturnine face. "I am glad you were not killed in the fighting, Norton," he said, "because you and Brent and the girl will make very valuable hostages for me when your spaceship eventually returns." Jerry turned and stared at Chester Sand. The Viking's safety officer was pale, but he met the other man's glance with a sort of weak defiance. Jerry's lip curled. "So you are the rat who slugged me that time I caught Olga in the radio room," he said. "I should have known it. I seem to have left several loose ends I should have watched, but I'll fix you for this some day, and—" "You won't be fixing anybody anymore, Norton," Lanza said grimly. "After I've used you to get possession of the Viking, you'll die in the torture chambers at Vakahausen. Thanks to my good friend Sands, I also know the location of the Invisible City. That, too, I will attend to, but all in good time. Guards, bind and gag the prisoners." He never finished the sentence. There was a sharp hiss and a thud. A narrow steel point stood a hand's breadth out beyond his throat. A wondering expression came into his eyes, then his knees buckled and he went down on the trampled grass. Across the garden, still holding the air gun from which he had shot the long steel slug, stood Sarnak of Lurala. The scaly ones went for their weapons, but a vengeful throng of the outlaw brood of the dragon came pouring up from below on the heels of their leaders. There was no thought of quarter between these hereditary foes. There was a short, sharp fight, and then the last of Lance's raiding party died in the shadow of the wall. Sarnak came striding forward, his hand outstretched and a cheerful smile on his broad face. "It seems that I come in very good time, my friends," he said. "Perfect," Jerry grinned, "but what does your coming mean?" "It means that the hour of deliverance is at hand. When Lanza brought his full force eastward against Savisa, it gave us the opportunity we have been needing for generations. We of the Dragon's Teeth rose against the scanty garrisons he left behind and put them to the sword. The mass of the people joined us then, when the chances of victory looked so strong that hope overcame the despair born of generations of oppression. Now the green folk of Giri have thrown off the yoke of the invader at last, and thousands of them are marching this way to take the army of the scaly ones in the rear."
That sounds dirty.
"But how did you come to arrive in the garden at this particular moment?" Jerry asked. "The forces of Giri have forded the river and are marching overland, but I came ahead with 100 picked cavalry mounted on swift saddle dolphins. We saw a crude type of underwater craft moving in this direction, and followed it at a distance. You know the rest. After bringing down the sentries that Lanza had posted below, we left our dolphins and our water helmets down at the main drain and crept up through the passages to this place." "When do you think the rest of the green folk will come?" Clozana asked. "Within a few more hours, Princess. They will not be in time to save your city, but they will be in time to protect the survivors." "If there are any of us left by then," the girl said bitterly. Jerry suddenly pointed upward. "Look there! The worst is over now!" he shouted. The Viking was streaking across the sky in a burst of yellow rocket flame. The big spaceship dropped down over the beleaguered city, her powerful ray tubes flashing. Other murky beams stabbed up to meet her, but her Duralite hull was impervious to the rays, and Angus kept her high enough so that the helicopters were protected by the curve of the hull. One after another, the raycasters and heavy gas guns of the scaly ones went out of action. When the ship's beams had silenced the artillery and commenced to rip black holes in the ranks of the reptilian warriors themselves, they suddenly broke and fled. The war drums of the scaly ones were silent at last, while the trumpets of Savisa raised a long-drawn paean of vengeance. Out of the ruined and flaming city fled the reptilian men, while troops of swift-footed Amazons hung on their flanks and rear with twanging bows. Back across the plains toward the border they fled, and ran squarely into the grim thousands of the green people, who tore them apart with the savagery of an oppressed race just finding their souls again. The few that survived, out of the powerful army that Lanza the mad earthman had brought eastward to attack Savisa, were a handful who fled back across the land of Giri and vanished into the desolate Vaca marshes, from which their people had first emerged generations before. The Golden City was hopelessly afire, past saving, and the survivors gathered on a level field outside the northern wall. Jerry and Sarnak and Rupin Sang were standing together as the Viking dropped down to land on the edge of the field. McTavish stepped out, red-bearded and jovial, but showing the effects of sleepless nights himself. "Sorry we couldn't get here sooner," he said, "but we've been working night and day to make proper repairs with that queer metal the people of Mourne gave us. We got your radio messages, but couldn't reply because the ship's sending set is broken, and I figured the helicopters were more important repairs." In a few brief words, Jerry told McTavish of the fight in the garden. The big Scot beamed his pleasure. "And did they get that slinking she-devil of an Olga along with the rest of the carrion?" he asked. Jerry shook his head. "No, she wasn't there. At least we didn't see her. It wasn't likely, though, that she would come. She probably remained back in Vacahausen." McTavish frowned his disappointment. "Ah, well," he shrugged. "You canna have everything." "Don't worry, McTavish," Sarnak grinned. "We'll probably have her in a few hours. A force of Savisans and Greenmen have already left to clean up Vacahausen." Jerry grinned. "Good. There's one thing I would like to suggest. I loathed Lansing as much as any of you, but he is a white man, and I dislike thinking that he may be hauled off and tossed into a common grave with the rest of the scaly ones. Let's go to the garden and see that his body has at least a halfway decent interment," as they put it on a pike. The rest of the party agreed to this, and they made their way back to the garden. They went down the steps leading to it, then all stopped in surprise. The bodies of the slain scaly men and Lanza were gone. McTavish rubbed his eyes unbelievingly. "What kind of devilment is this?" he whispered. Sarnak shook his head slowly. "I don't understand. Unless the retreating forces found them and carried them along with them. They were all dead, of that I'm sure." "Lansing too?" inquired McTavish suspiciously. Jerry laughed. "Lansing never walked away from here, unless as a ghost. I saw him go down, and men with an arrow transfixing their throats don't do much walking." But the big Scot didn't seem entirely convinced, and as they walked away he was still shaking his great shaggy head in doubt. With the strain of the siege over at last, many of the garrison had simply dropped to the ground and gone to sleep where they fell. Jerry was watching the flames sweep over the last of the city. For a long time the arrow tower remained standing above the sea of fire, but then it began to tip. Faster and faster it fell till it came down in a shower of sparks. Clozana dropped her head in her hands, but old Rupin Sang touched his daughter on the shoulder. "Save your grief, girl," he said. "It is true that the golden city of our fathers no longer exists, but there was a second part to the prophecy, that after the great disaster the people of Savisa would have a rebirth. A message that just came through from those of our people who are hidden in the hills tells me that, of 10 children who have been born since we sent the non-combatants out of the city, 7 have been boys. The curse has been lifted from our race." 2 days later, even before the ashes of Lar were cool, working parties of Amazons began to clear away the ruins to prepare for the building of a new city. Sarnak of Lirala had already returned across the river Giri to supervise the rebuilding of his own land. Angus McTavish came up to where Rupin Sang and Jerry stood in front of the king's tent. "Tests all complete, Chief," he said. "That material we got in Mourne is all right." "I don't suppose there's any way of thanking them for it." The big Scot shook his head slowly, tugging at his beard. "The city isn't there anymore." "What do you mean?" "Just that it's gone. We heard the bells a few hours after you left, and then we never heard them again. You can walk clean across the plain where the city stood. Sand from the beach is drifting into the holes that held the wall foundations, and grass is already beginning over the rest of the place. It's gone, that's all. They were queer folk, the people of Morn, Jerry said moodily. I suppose they were afraid they might get dragged into the affairs of the planet in spite of themselves, and simply moved the whole city off to some distant and unknown planet. But how could they do that? McTavish said. Jerry shrugged. Ask me another. How could they make the place invisible? We know they did that. We don't know how much further their science went. Anyway, I'm going to be glad to get back to Earth for a while. I guess we're ready to start. He turned to look at Clozana for a moment. The girl had laid aside her battered armor for her customary bright loincloth and golden breastplates. She shook back her long golden hair and faced him with a smile. Want to come back to Earth with me, Clozana? He asked. Either that or the ship goes back without its captain, she said quietly. Jerry laughed. Darling, I feel sorry for any Earth woman who ever concludes you're some shy little stranger she can patronize. Well, the trails of interplanetary space are long and we'd better get going. All aboard! Whatever. Golden Amazons of Venus, Part 9, The End. The Golden Amazons of Venus by John Murray Reynolds. From Planet Stories, Winter 1939, as found on Project Gutenberg, narrated by Julie Hoverson. Music is from Zephon, as found on Jamindo.